Hello everybody, today we'll be talking about the scientific endeavor, the first chapter of lower sec science. And in this chapter, we'll be discussing three main areas. Number one, we'll be discussing how what is science and how to go about doing a scientific experiment. The second part of the video would actually be talking about how do we actually, what are the apparatus or use the apparatus, lab apparatus in a science lab. So why do we need to do that? Because in any experiment, we usually measure items or collect results and data. So we will definitely need a few instruments to do it. And lastly, we will focus on the use of a Bunsen burner, a key instrument that is found in the lab, in which a common question that can be asked is you are given a particular picture of how a Bunsen burner looks like, and you are required to actually identify the parts and to describe what are its features and function. So without further ado, let's begin with the first part. So in the first part, right, we will be actually asking what is science. So science is the systematic study of nature to discover the facts about them and how they actually affect living things with the physical environment. So this is in a nutshell what science is, and there are three different branches of science. We have biology, second we have chemistry, and lastly we have physics. So for biology is basically how the study of how living things are able to interact with one another and also how it affects their life. So things that deals with living things we will talk about in bio. Chemistry deals with the atoms and the ions, or mainly things that we can't really see physically. It's down to the small particles and how they actually behave or how reactions actually occur. So that's chemistry for us. Physics would be how the physical environment or physical items, physical properties are able to interact with one another and also with us. So that is basically physics. Now, next is who is then the one actually studying all this? We usually call someone who studies these three areas of branches of science a scientist. And in order to study science, we scientists has actually established a scientific method that will present itself as a logical and rational order of steps to help us to actually reach a particular conclusion around the world about the world around us. So how it begins over here is this particular map, okay, which I will go through in detail. It starts with asking a question or through a particular observation, right? And then subsequently we will ask a question. Okay, so it's either there's a problem or through an observation that eventually lead to us asking a question. What will happen if this increase, or what will happen if that decrease? Okay, so that will be known as a hypothesis. And through your hypothesis, you will list a range of variables. We'll be discussing more of the variables subsequently, and then we perform the experiment. And through doing the experiment, which is your steps, okay, procedures of using the apparatus, we will collect and record results. After recording the results and data, we will analyze it to reach to a final conclusion. This conclusion is like the final answer to answer the original question in our hypothesis. So depending on what the results are, we would see if we are correct. Is our hypothesis true? If it's true, we can slowly share with others our findings through communication. However, if there is not enough evidence, okay, or not enough facts to support our hypothesis, we would then re-establish. That means we make a new hypothesis, and the whole process happens again and again. Okay. This time round, I am trying a new style, which is I would actually write down what are some of the key points, and this will be presented as a form of like notes that allows you to study well. And at the same time, with this particular podcast, you'll be able to follow the trains of thoughts of what every individual item is like. Okay, so let's begin. So if as we look into the problem, right? So problem is something like coming to school without any form of transport. And let's say you stay in the east and your school is in the west. For you to get to your school, you need to travel 2-3 hours. with a public transport. Okay, for example, this is hypothetical. So that's a problem. So you identify it. Then you will ask the question, like, how do I go about uh, cutting down or reducing the distance? Is it by the mode of transport? Is it by the distance? Or maybe you believe that, okay, by drinking more milk, I can reach there faster. So these are some questions that you can ask, but you have identified the problem, which is how to get to school within the shortest period of time. Okay, then observation will be, for example, um, you see that plants are green in color. Then you ask, then you see like, oh, why does it have to be green in color? Or what are some of the factors that can affect the plant from becoming more green, or actually to have a lighter green shade? So then you ask yourself, okay, so maybe you see your neighbor, they shine UV ray onto the plant and it's actually lighter in color as compared to, let's say you have another neighbor who has the same plant but different, but doesn't use the UV light ray. Yeah, then you, through this observation, you will ask yourself, which is better, depending on whether you want to grow the shade, the darker shade. The second thing you can ask yourself is, does it help the plant to grow better, grow taller? So these are some examples of observations or problems that can slowly formulate into short hypotheses. So after you have through, so you see all these problems helps to frame what area, it helps to scope what you want to investigate. And the next step that you usually do is to do extensive research and extensive data collection to help to form up your hypothesis. Okay, so in a sense is in school we have done the paper aeroplane experiment. So we have actually done extensive research into how paper aeroplanes are able to travel further. Is it by the folding? Is it by the weight? Is it by the length? Is it by the material? So these are the examples. So that is how we use extensive research to help to further understand our problem or observation to come up with a relevant hypothesis. If you do not do this research portion, the hypothesis will be all around and eventually you will always be stuck at repeating, re-establishing a new hypothesis. So this step is important. The step of doing proper extensive research to form your hypothesis helps you to reduce the number of times you coming out with a new hypothesis, as every step requires time, every step requires a lot of money and effort. Okay, so you want to reduce that and to be very sharp. Okay, so to be a good scientist is generally being very clear with observation, being very being very observant, and being very lucky, and also to be very sharp in forming appropriate hypothesis that has a higher chance of understanding the problem. So what is then this hypothesis? Okay, the hypothesis is generally a prediction of the effect of changing one variable with another. So let's ask so let's say the one about the UV light. Okay, so what we can see is when you increase does, or you can ask the question, so it's like a question, it's like, does increasing the light, the intensity, that means the brightness of it, okay, does increasing the light intensity increases the height of a plant at the same maybe temperature. So what you can see here is you already have, this is an example of a hypothesis where what you are trying to investigate is, by understanding light, how much light is required, will it actually affect the height of the plant, assuming that the temperature is always the same. Now, the reason why I highlight these 3 points is because there are 3 types of variable. What are these 3 types of variable? Number 1, we have your independent variable. Number 2, you have your dependent variable. And lastly, you have the controlled variable. Now, all these mean different things. So independent variable is basically the factor. It's basically the factor which is controlled. I wouldn't use the word controlled. I would say manipulated intentionally. Now, what this actually means is that you are the one to control the variable, because ask yourself, in this particular hypothesis, are you able to control height of the plant? You can't, right? I mean, you don't expect yourself to pull the plant, okay? You can control the light intensity, you can control the temperature, and in this case, the light intensity is the one that you want to investigate. So you will vary your light intensity. And usually when you plot a graph, this belongs to the x-axis. Next, we look at the dependent variable. So for the dependent variable, it's basically the factor that changes with respect to, WRT is with respect to the independent variable, which is number 1. Okay. So whenever an independent variable which you change, it will slowly influence the dependent variable on how it actually acts. And this is usually plotted as the y-axis of the graph. Okay, so for a graph, it is like this, okay, where this is the x-axis and the y is a vertical line. Okay. So this is how it is. Now, controlled on the other hand, okay, let's see if I can use another one. Control, on the other hand, is basically factors that has to be kept the same. That means these factors, if it's not kept the same, it can also change or affect the height of the plant. So these are like some of the examples which we want to keep the same. So this is controlled. So in this particular hypothesis, you can pause the video now to try to guess, is light intensity independent, dependent, or controlled variable? Is the height the controlled, dependent, or independent variable? And likewise about temperature. Okay, I guess you all would have already found out what the answer. So let's look at the answer. So for light intensity, this is actually the independent variable, as this is the one that you can control. For the height, it is the dependent variable. Why? Because it is dependent by the amount of light intensity. So whether it increase or decrease for height depends on how highly concentrated or less concentrated the amount of light intensity is being given. And same temperature, the hint is same at temperature, so this would be the controlled variable. Okay, so in general, a typical exam questions that usually comes out in this chapter is that they'll give a story, then they'll ask you identify what is the hypothesis. So to write a good hypothesis, right, you need to have a few things. Number 1, you need to be able to state what is the independent variable, what's the relationship. So relationship means how it affects. So the words that are underlined are examples of relationship. So how does the relationship of the independent variable influence the dependent variable, considering that the other variables are kept constant? You have to give the exact names depending on what is given. Okay, so that is how we usually phrase our hypothesis. It can even be as simple as, it doesn't have to be a relationship, it can be as like, to investigate how light intensity influences the height of the plant under the same temperature. So you see what you did was you just changed the words on it. So usually you can use the word investigate, you can use the word influence, but it should also include your variables like light intensity, which is the independent variable, the height of the plant, which is the dependent variable, and lastly, the temperature, which is the controlled variable. And this will be a complete one. And once you write a good hypothesis, the subsequent questions on what is the independent variable, what is the dependent variable, what's the controlled variable, you can give. So that will give you a lot of marks. Okay. Of course, next we look into experimentation and conclusion. Now, for experimentation, right, it's a list of steps, which is at this particular junction, I would not want to confuse you. But do take note that for experimentation, the recording and analyzing of results comes with coming up with tables, coming up with a graph, and to conclude, to give the trend, what do you expect the observation should give you. Okay, now why are we doing this? Why is it so important to come up with all these scientific processes? Okay, the reason for coming out such scientific processes is to ensure that that the that the experiment is actually fair. Now, in order to solve something is fair, you need to do repeats. That means you repeat the experiment again and again and again. Okay, not the whole item here, not basically the whole structure here, but actually it's in this particular portion only. So rather than you repeat the experiment once, you do it for multiple readings to ensure that they are consistent and fair. Okay, then you can take the average. The other thing to do all this is to actually establish a cause and effect relationship. Now, what do we mean by cause and effect? If we look at the example that was given, it is mainly what is the does the light intensity affect the height? So you are establishing whether light intensity will cause a change in height, which is the effect. And of course, you must be able to measure and implement all this. Next is to do all this, right? To study science, you must have a few desirable attitudes. For example, you have to be curious, so there's curiosity. Number two, you must be honest with integrity because you do not want to fake your results. Perseverance. Why perseverance? Because to do multiple experiment, it is something that you do not know whether will it actually be true, whether will it be able to tell your conclusion. So you must always repeat. That takes a lot of perseverance. Next, we look at creativity. In order to come up with interesting experiments that is logically sound, you have to be creative with what you have. And more importantly, you must be very interested in the topic. And because everyone is doing experiment, you must also be willing to accept ideas and criticism from other people. And last but not least, have to be patient, as some experiment is not like the ones you do in the science lab where it's very fast. It takes time. Okay, so these are some of the things to take notice of. And then so what we have covered is generally the scientific method of doing research. How do we go about understanding problems, hypotheses? Experimentation is basically the tool to validate the hypothesis as it provides a logical process to learn about the problem and observation. You record your results, you analyze your results, and then you make inference to explain what the results are talking about. So that is experimentation. Conclusion is the summary of the results from the experiment to validate the hypothesis of the problem or observation. And last but not least, communication is the sharing of your results. So once a hypothesis is supported by many different many other investigation. That means student A does it, got the same results, student B does it, got the same results. Then from a hypothesis, it will then be able to establish into a theory, and from a theory it will be coming out as a fact. So this is how the branches is being repeated again. So hypothesis is basically you do the experiment, everyone do the experiment, got the same conclusion, it becomes a theory. And through the theory, the theory has to be supported in different environment, different condition before it becomes a fact. So that's how we go about designing it. Then of course we talk about the three variables. Independent is what you change, dependent variable is what you observe and measure, and last but not least, controlled is the controlled variable is what you usually keep the same. Okay, we also talk about how to go about writing it, and then the importance of science is generally like using technology. Like technology is the application of scientific knowledge in our world, and science cannot stop or prevent occurrence of natural disaster such as tsunami or earthquake. So in a sense, we also do recognize that science has several limitations. Science cannot resolve ethical and moral issues like abortion, human genetic engineering, caring for elderly. Scientific knowledge can also change from time to time, and hence the explanation for certain observation may not be relevant in the future. So these are our limitations for science. However, science can also help to promote technology, and with technology, it improves our quality of life in various fields like communication, agriculture, medicine, transport, and others. Okay, so with that, I will end this particular segment of the video. Stay tuned for the next video that talks about the scientific laboratory apparatus, how to go about measuring it, how you use it, and then the Bunsen burner, and then I will see you for the next video. Do click here to subscribe, and also do click here to view the next particular video. If not, good luck, thank you, and have a nice day.